This week on LeafsCast, we'll recap the Leafs West Coast trip. As well, we'll talk about all the injuries that the Leafs have mounted up. We're going to talk about some fundamental changes that maybe the Leafs need to make in this short week where they have 6 days off between games. We'll also talk about the Leafs trying JVR at center, and we'll also preview the game on Friday and Saturday. The Devils coming to Toronto, and Toronto headed to Boston. As well, we'll answer your questions, and we'll talk on some of your comments. All this coming up on LeafsCast. Hello and welcome to LeafsCast. My name's Mark Paul. I'm the host of LeafsCast. You know, LeafsCast, my dream and my vision for this podcast, I'd always done other podcasts and attempted to do a few other hockey-related things. And I always just came back to this like, my goodness, it is hard to follow the entire league. Every little thing happening, like I feel like you need to have a show for every single team, and it's just not feasible. And so, you know, the Leafs are my team. They have been all growing up ever since I was like 4 or 5 years old. Is the first time I can really remember watching a Leafs game and cheering for the Leafs with my dad. Just decided, you know, this podcast needs to be all about the Leafs, because if you're a fan of the Leafs, I understand. I have a little bit extra time, but not everybody has the time to be able to watch every single Leafs game. And I'm fortunate enough to get to watch pretty much every Leafs game. And even if I can't watch it live, I'll watch it recorded later on. And so I love just being able to give you a little bit of extra info and tidbits on what's going on with the Leafs. And even if you get to watch the game, just some banter and some thoughts as to how the Leafs are doing, what's going on in the organization. And so as we've had some pregame shows and we've had postgame shows, we've also had one kind of topical episode, and this is another topical episode. This is where I want to break down what the Leafs have done in the last week. Let's talk about maybe some overarching Toronto Maple Leafs things that don't relate to any specific game necessarily, and we can just kind of talk Leafs, have some fun. I love getting comments and questions from those of you that are out there listening. You make the show. You really allow me to come up with topics and come up with things to talk about. And it's just a lot more fun when you're the one asking the question and you're able to participate in the show. It's a blast when we're actually able to do that. I mean, honestly, I have questions all the way ranging from my mom. My mom's a huge Leafs fan, so why wouldn't I let my mom ask a question? She posted on it, so I'm gonna answer my mother's question on LeafsCast. Before we get to your questions and before we really dive into it, let's just recap the last week for the Leafs. It was a pretty good week on a West Coast trip where a lot of people, I mean, I think we expected to probably come out with 2 wins, but at the same time, there's always that unknown, because when we head out west, there's just something that happens to the Leafs. I know there's the time change, and there's maybe some thought about I don't know, elevation, or I don't know, too much to smell of oil in Edmonton. But the Leafs just seem to have struggled on their West Coast trip. They went 2-1. They beat the Edmonton Oilers 4-0 on the back of a James Reimer shutout, and then flipped over into Calgary, where Bernier the next night took over, and he wins it 4-2, and then they go into Vancouver on Saturday, and they just completely dropped the ball, looked like they were completely void of any type of energy, and the Leafs drop it 4-0 on Pavel Bure night. And so the Leafs, in a week where they go 2-1, they only play, it's interesting, they only played 3 games, and then they only are playing 2 games this next week. So other teams have kind of the opportunity to catch back up in the standings, and we've seen that. We've seen how sometimes, I don't know why it always feels like the Leafs play a lot more games than everybody else, and other teams are playing catch-up, but we have played more games than most teams. Not anymore. After the Red Wings played on Tuesday night, we were able to see, Monday night. They've now actually played more games than the Leafs, and the Leafs are kind of in this spot where, you know, Boston is still a couple games behind, but it looks like where they're slotted right now is it may end up be where they're going to be at once everybody's equal in games, which is a good sign. It's always sometimes a little bit nerve-wracking when you see your team so far ahead in games, and you're wondering, all right, what happens if this team, the team chasing them, wins all their games? Well, then we're moving way back, and you start to fear, like almost these stupid fears of like, oh man, what if every single team behind them wins? I mean, it's not even feasible. Somebody has to lose and somebody has to play each other, so not every team's going to win. But it's those weird little things that pop into your mind when you're looking at the standings, and you just want the Leafs to stay where they are and continue to move forward. The only team ahead of them in the conference, well, there's two technically. Well, Tampa Bay has the same amount of wins. They played one less game than the Leafs. And so we're deadlocked at 20 points along with the Detroit Red Wings, who have played one more game than Toronto. First place in the East, the Pittsburgh Penguins, who we actually beat. We beat the Penguins. So I think a good sign that the Leafs were able to hold tight against them. That was the previous Saturday before this week. So when we look at the Toronto Maple Leafs and we look at how their week went, it went pretty well, other than the catastrophic injury that we saw coming from Zach Kassian stepped on the back of David Bolland's ankle, tearing his Achilles heel. It's such a bummer. David Bolland had been playing so well. He really looked like he was moving into his own as a Toronto Maple Leaf. Like the Chicago Blackhawks almost made a mistake for not keeping him in their top six. And now I understand why the Blackhawks traded him, and it was almost like they had to move somebody. It's the salary cap era. It's what needed to happen, and the Leafs are to gain in this. Unfortunately, he goes down with an injury, and I'm concerned. I'm concerned because, and actually, this is the question my mom asked: how long do you think Bolland will be out, and how will this affect the team's game? And man, if Tyler Bozak wasn't out, it wouldn't be as big of an issue. But just with Bozak out, that immediately raises some questions as to what the Leafs are going to do. Now, they have made some changes and some pretty good ones. If you remember last year before the lockout and when the season was supposed to start regular, the Leafs were actually going to start James Van Riemsdyk at center. They were going to try him at center between Kessel and Lupul. Remember when Kessel and Lupul were the thing? And it was that line. It was that idea of, man, if we have Kessel and Lupul, we can put whoever we want in the middle, and they're going to be great. That has kind of shifted to, well, let's have Kessel and Van Riemsdyk, and then we can have Kadri or we can have Bozak up the middle. But it no longer makes sense to load up that front line because there's really no other center that can play. And so JVR is going to slip into that center spot on the first line. So Lupul, James Van Riemsdyk, and Phil Kessel will be the first line. Kadri with Raymond and Clarkson as his wingers. Looks like it's going to be the second line. And then you'll have McClement with Kuhlman and Brody for now until Carter Ashton. I'm going to make the assumption that when Carter Ashton comes back from his 2-game suspension that he got against Calgary last week, that Brody will be moved down to the fourth line and that Carter Ashton will come in. More than likely, you'll see McLaren as a healthy scratch, depending on who they play. Maybe not against Boston. They might try to use the intimidation factor a little bit, but at the same time, you need a guy like Carter Ashton in there. He'll throw it around his body, and he can play third-line minutes. He's decently responsible defensively, so that definitely helps. With the injury to Dave Bolland, this is what I'm concerned with. Now, Erik Karlsson suffered the very similar injury, if not the exact same injury is what we're hearing, and he was out for 10 weeks. Now, what concerns me is that when Erik Karlsson came back, he was but a shell of himself, and he now has gotten back to the place where he was when he was injured. He's back to that place. Just tonight, which is Tuesday, November 5th. He scored 2 goals tonight, and one was in an empty net, but the other one was a nice goal, and he's moving the puck well. He's playing the way Erik Karlsson played when he won the Norris Trophy. The problem is it took a year to get back to that point, and I'm wondering about Dave Bolland. I'm wondering if when he comes back, is he going to be a little slower? Because I don't know if he can afford to lose the speed. Is it going to affect the way that he goes into corners? I don't think you're looking at a 10-week injury here. They're saying at least 8 weeks. I think you're probably looking into March, maybe even April. Maybe he can come back for the start of the playoffs. And obviously at that point, you're going to take a David Bolland. He's going to give you all he has in the playoffs. But this injury is long-term. And the problem with it is that so is Bozak's. Bozak can't even return until November 21st. That's another 3 weeks that we have to figure out something at center. And hopefully James Van Riemsdyk, why do I keep calling him John? My goodness. James. There we go. It's James Van Riemsdyk. Hopefully he plays well at center. Hopefully he can win draws. It's not like Nazem Kadri was winning a huge percentage of them on that top line, but Bozak certainly won those. And Dave Bolland was pretty solid in the faceoff circle himself. And so possession in your own zone and in the opposition zone off of faceoffs, you may see that dramatically decline with the lack of face-off caliber type of NHL players. And so that's what makes me worried about this injury. I think the Leafs can replace David Bolland's scoring. I think they can replace some of like what you'd call his tenacity, his willingness to go into the quarter. One thing I'm noticing, though, is how important was that Mason Raymond signing? Mason Raymond he squeaked under the radar, and the Leafs picked him up last minute. He was on a tryout option. Now Mason Raymond's playing in their top six, and if he wasn't there, you'd have to have Kuhlman or Brody in the top six right now as the Leafs stand. That would be trouble. And so it's a very, very fortunate thing that they have Mason Raymond that they're able to do that. There is good news on the horizon, though, regarding injury. Mark Fraser, he's supposed to return Friday, and we can expect that Paul Ranger will be a healthy scratch. Now, whether or not you like Paul Ranger, it doesn't really matter. I really think that Mark Fraser is the better defenseman. He plays the way that Randy Carlyle wants his defenseman to play, and in reality, he's just a lot better for Jake Gardiner. I mean, when Paul Ranger's playing with Jake Gardiner, you're often worried that both of them are going to pinch and that Paul Ranger's going to make a mistake, and so is Jake Gardiner, and it wasn't as big of a deal when Mark Fraser was playing with him, but now that Gardiner is playing with Paul Ranger, and I know he's playing with him earlier in the year too, but this will give the defense a stay-at-home defenseman, a true stay-at-home guy, and Carl Gunnarsson is that guy, but Mark Fraser is just the epitome of a stay-at-home defenseman. Not going to do much offensively for you. He does have a decent shot, but Mark Fraser is just what the Leafs need. They need some depth on the blue line. They have it back now that he's back from his injury. Potentially, does it give the Leafs an ability to trade someone away? I'm not sure. I don't think that the Leafs would want to do that. I know that there's always trade rumors going all over the place, but I think that it would be foolish, obviously, to get rid of an NHL caliber defenseman. Regardless or not, if you like Paul Ranger, that's fine. It's been tough to like him. In the first 10 games, he was rough. I've talked about it before, that the Leafs need to be patient with Paul Ranger, and they have been, and they will be. They'll continue to be. It's okay that he's going to be a healthy scratch. He'll see his way back into the lineup. It's not a bad thing. But Paul Ranger is probably the kind of guy that you'd get at the deadline. He's a guy that, he's going to make his mistakes, but he can fill a hole, and when there's an injury, he can come in and he can play well enough to where maybe you only notice him 2 or 3 times a game, and hopefully he doesn't make that catastrophic error. But Paul Ranger, I mean, really, if you're going around the league and you're hoping to trade, kind of get that depth defenseman, prefer a 4th or 5th round draft pick that you maybe just pick up to put in the bank just in case a guy goes down. That's Paul Ranger. We have him. He's on our team. He's already inundated with these players. So we don't need to trade Paul Ranger. We don't need to trade any of our defensemen other than John Michael Lyles, which like any of us are gonna send him packing for whatever reason. It doesn't matter. You can sell him for a bag of pucks. I honestly wouldn't be opposed to the Leafs giving away up to maybe a 3rd round draft pick. I'd feel more comfortable with a 4th round pick, but if somebody was willing to take John Michael Lyles off our hands for a 3rd round pick, like, hey, we're going to give you Lyles and a 3rd round pick for someone that you don't want either, but has not as big of a salary cap hit, I think you take it. I think it's worth it. Now let's switch gears just a little bit. Let's look at actually what the Leafs are working on this previous week. I've heard some different things, obviously seen different articles and interviews with different players about what they're working on in practice this week. It's really interesting that all the players know it. Okay, we get outshot. I mean, that's kind of been the case for the last 2 or 3 years. And finally, it's been okay. Last season and early on in the year, it's been fine that they've been getting outshot. This West Coast road trip, it kind of raised some question marks because of the 43 shots, 43 shots, and 47 shots that teams got against the Leafs. That is a lot of shots. That's 133, I believe. That's a lot of shots. They know that they need to balance out the shots on goal. But let's be honest here. The Leafs are going to work on